I hereby call this meeting of Norwood City Council to order. Please rise for the invocation and pledge of allegiance. This evening, we do not have anyone to do the invocation, so we'll have 60 seconds of silence. Thank you. Now for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Here.
Mrs. Hoover.
Here.
Ms. Royce.
Here.
Mr. Kelch.
Here.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Here.
Mr. Thompson.
Here.
Mr. Braden.
Here. All members present. Moving on to item E, amendment of the agenda. Be patient. I have 4 items. The first one we're adding is an ordinance. This will be M4, ordinance imposing a temporary moratorium on the consideration and/or granting of zoning, occupancy, building, or other permits or applications related to vape stores within the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency. Next, we're adding ordinance M5, an ordinance amending Chapter 561 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances entitled Parks and Playgrounds to expand and clarify alcohol permits. Then under communications, we're adding Q3, which is the mayor's court communication. And finally, under special presentations, we will be adding land acknowledgement, which will be read by Shauna Holt this evening. And that is all the additions that I have. May I have a motion? Mrs. Franzen?
I move that we amend the agenda as stated.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen. May I have a second? Mrs. Hoover?
A second.
Second by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. Moving on to item F, we have minutes of previous meetings, October 10th, 2023, and October 24th, 2023. Mr. Thompson,
Would move that we receive and file the minutes as if read.
motion by Mr. Thompson to receive and file the minutes as if read. Mr. Braden.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. Moving on this evening, item G, we have special presentations. Mrs. Shauna Holt, please come forward. Thank you. Mrs. Hoover, I think you wanted to introduce.
I was just going to introduce, in recognition of November as Native American Heritage Month, I have asked my good friend Shauna Holt to do the land acknowledgement.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Shauna Holt. I'm an enrolled member of the Omaha tribe. My Omaha name is Dewa'u, which translates to Buffalo Woman, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this for you. To recognize the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on the land, and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context, but rather our ongoing participation. Norwood, Ohio is located within the traditional homelands of the Maami, Shawnee, Kaskia peoples, who along with other indigenous groups ceded these lands to the United States in the first Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Maami people were forcibly removed from these homelands in 1846. This is the home of Norwood Mound, the highest elevation in the area. It is believed to have been constructed by the Adena people, Ohio's earliest Native American people, during the pre-Columbian era from 1000 BC to 200 AD. Perhaps understanding the significance and sacred grounds the mound possesses, early European settlers left it undisturbed. The mound was listed on the National Register of Historic Places on May 2nd, 1974, and still stands today. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on this evening to requests to address council. We have one request to address council this evening. Bishop Sonny James.
First, to God be all the glory. I want to first extend a true heart condolences to the families that are involved in wars across the land, across the world, and pray that we can see reconciliation happening. Also want to, as we see gun violence is still prevalent, I want to recognize that we will soon be addressing some of those issues to continue the fight to keep our city, our streets here in Norwood safe and protected from those that for some reason feel it necessary to strike out at others aimlessly. And so we will begin a campaign here to specifically address that and to eradicate that out of our great community. Now, with that being said, I'm here tonight just so excited because we recently had a march on the streets of Norwood. And I've been coming here and saying for a long time, one of the things that I just can't stand is hearing people still say Norwood is Norwood. And I continue to say, my brothers, my sisters, Norwood is a wonderful place to be. In fact, I usually say, you better ask somebody or come check it out. And so during this march, I was so excited by Chris Kelsch and his zeal to communicate with me, constantly trying to get this tape recording of him blessing this event. And we went back and forth, and it was just hysterical to just see how we both were busy, but yet he took the time to prioritize trying to get a communication for it. And I look up during the march, and Mr. Braden is there with smiles on his face, and our mayor and his wife were there, and I remember even during the march telling him, come on up here. He was like, I'm okay. And I'm like, get up here, man. Get on up here. And he and his wife were there. And one of the reasons that we did the march, yes, it was a part of the film, A Fire You Can't Put Out. Yes, it made history. That's all great. But one of the greatest accomplishments that it gained is that folk who had thought Norwood would never come together. Folk who had pretty much just said Norwood is only a racist town. I am still weeks later getting phone calls and text messages saying, Bishop, I cannot believe it. We were actually on the streets of Norwood, Ohio. And I'm like, yeah, calm down. It's the first of many. And when the mayor read the proclamation, you could see tears swelling up in the face of folk who had lost confidence in the ability of people who may have had issues actually come together. We had two rabbis, one, as you may know, those that were there, an internationally recognized rabbi. And he kept pulling on me during the march saying, Bishop, what's next? What are we doing next? And I told him at the end of the march, I don't know yet, because I'm not going to do it without my peers. I'm not going to just schedule something and do it on my own. I want it to be Norwood. I want it to be something that our children's children can be proud of. So I just want to say to all of you, I love you. I know that we've recently had an election, and by the people's votes, some things are changing, but you know what? I want to celebrate every one of you that have served this community. And I'm trusting that those that won't be in the seats, like me, I don't need a seat. Because you're going to see me anyway. I'm going to be present. But I want to thank our city, our safety service director. I want to thank our chief of police. I want to thank the fire chief. I want to thank our law department. I want to thank our mayor. And I want to thank all of the residents who believe that we could do this and that we could make history. And that we've done. I love you all. I thank God for Norwood, Ohio. And let's keep striving. We'll do our Martin Luther King March coming up, our Black History March. But we're going to do everything from this day forward together because we're family. God bless you.
Thank you, Bishop James. Moving on to item L1, second reading of ordinances and resolutions. L1, ordinance approving the proposed text amendments to Part 11 of the codified ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Ordinance Amending Part 11 Planning and Zoning Code related to various chapters to promote clarity and consistency and policy interpretation, organizing various definitions and terms, processing minor PUD applications, porous pavement, minor accessory equipment structures, townhouses, electric vehicle charging stations, and other related changes. Mrs. Franzen.
I move that we have the second reading of this ordinance.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to have the second reading. May I have a second? Mr. Braden.
I'll second that. Thank you.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes.
Ordinance approving the proposed text amendments to Part 11 of the codified ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Ordinance Amending Part 11, Planning and Zoning Code, relating to various chapters to promote clarity and consistency in policy interpretation, organizing various definitions and terms, processing minor PUD applications, porous pavement, minor accessory equipment structures, townhouses, electric vehicle charging stations, and other related changes.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Moving on to item L2. Ordinance disapproving the proposed text amendment to Part 11 of the codified ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Ordinance Amending Part 11 Planning and Zoning Code, relating to various chapters to promote clarity and consistency and policy interpretation, organizing various definitions and terms, processing minor PUD applications, porous pavement, minor accessory equipment structures, townhouses, electric vehicle charging stations, and other related changes. Mrs. Hoover.
Make a motion that we have the second reading.
Motion by Mrs. Hoover to have the second reading. May I have a second? Ms. Royce?
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Royce. Any discussion? Mrs. Franzen?
I was wondering if we need to read this one, since I think, at least from my perspective, now that we've had time to look at the proposed text amendments, I'm more inclined to approve the ordinance, but I didn't know procedurally how that would work, if we needed to continue to read this one or what. Just open question to the floor.
Mr. Moore?
If council's decided that they think they're going to approve it, then you probably don't. In fact, you probably don't need both on the agenda. We started, when I became lawyer, we just like, let's prepare both, because we had one where we wanted to say no, but we don't have an ordinance that says that. We're going to need an ordinance. So, but until council decides to approve or not, it's probably I would just keep it moving with the process. You could table it, and if you come up at the next meeting and decide, we really hate this idea, we're not going to approve it, then you'll have a copy of it there. But, you started this way, you might want to keep going. I guess the bottom line is, it doesn't matter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Yeah.
Ms. Franzen?
So,
Mrs. Franzen?
I didn't know if anyone else had any strong feelings tabling versus just continuing. I'm good with whatever. If I do enjoy making you read out the same ordinance twice. I think that's funny.
Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, motion passes.
Ordinance disapproving the proposed text amendments to Part 11 of the codified ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Ordinance Amending Part 11, Planning and Zoning Code, relating to various chapters to promote clarity and consistency in policy interpretation, organizing various definitions and terms, processing minor PUD applications, porous pavement, minor accessory equipment structures, townhouses, electric vehicle charging stations, and other related changes.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Moving on to item M, introductory reading of ordinances and resolutions. M1, ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2023 and declaring an emergency. Mr. Thompson?
Move we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Mr. Kelch?
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, just to let everyone know, this is just a small appropriations change to the water fund and the cornerstone fund. Happens at the end of the year as we make sure the right amount of money is in each key.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes.
Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2023 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2023 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2023 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mrs. Winterbauer.
Motion to pass the ordinance?
Motion by Mrs. Winterbauer to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item M2, ordinance adopting request to add leave donation program policy and form to the City of Norwood's Personnel Policy and Procedure Manual effective upon approval by council and declaring an emergency. Mrs. Franzen.
I move that we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Mrs. Hoover.
A second?
Second by Mrs. Hoover.
Good evening, Council. Marie Springer, Human Resources Director. Recently, it came to our attention that there was a request form that did not have any policy attached to it. And this was in regard to employees donating time for other employees in need of leave due to a serious illness or serious injury. Therefore, I would like to request that council approve the stated policy and an updated Form II to be added to the PPM, the Personnel Policy and Procedures Manual, Section 5.20. The policy includes the following parameters. There would be a request by an employee or their manager or department head for the leave donation. There would be privacy of medical nature enforced and also respected, and just to inform coworkers that there was a critical need for the leave donation. There would be a request of a review committee comprised of the Safety Services Director, the Employees Manager or Department Head, and also HR to review the need for the leave, and also to continue if after 90 days for further review. The employee would have to have a serious injury or a serious illness, and we would have to have documentation from an attending physician. The employee has applied for any paid leave as well as any workers' comp or benefits program for which they are eligible, and the donated time could also be used for any waiting periods that needed to be fulfilled. This would be for full-time employees, and they would be able to receive up to 40 hours per week. The employees using donated time will still be considered in active pay status, and they would still accrue leave, and that leave would have to be used up first, and they would still be entitled to their benefits at that time. Used donated leave will not count towards any probationary period. Employees donating the leave could donate vacation, sick, comp, or any other PTO that they have in their banks, and this would be converted to sick time for the receiving employee. They would fill out Form II, and it would be a voluntary election with the understanding that this leave would not be returned. They would have to retain a combined minimum balance of 80 hours in their banks in order to donate, and there is a minimum 8-hour donation and a 15-day per the fiscal year. Do you have any questions?
Anyone? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We have a motion on the floor by Mrs. Franzen, a second by Mrs. Hoover to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes.
Ordinance adopting request to add leave donation program policy and Form II to the City of Norwood's Personnel Policy and Procedure Manual, effective upon approval by council, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance adopting request to add leave donation program policy and Form II to the City of Norwood's Personnel Policy and Procedure Manual, effective upon approval by council, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance adopting request to add leave donation program policy and Form II to the City of Norwood's Personnel Policy and Procedure Manual, effective upon approval by council, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mr. Thompson.
Move we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to pass the ordinance. Mr. Braden.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item M3, resolution authorizing the city auditor to approve a then and now certificate from the General Fund 1001-0842-57153 to cover the cost of an invoice for the Ohio Police and Fire Pension Fund for $35,769.13 and declaring an emergency. Mr. Thompson.
Move we have to suspend the rules and have all three readings of this resolution.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to suspend the rules and have all three readings. May I have a second? Mrs. Winterbauer.
That's good.
Second by Mrs. Winterbauer. Any discussion? Mr. Thompson.
I would like to ask Mr. Powers if he could let us know what this is.
Unfortunately, I'm really not able to give any extra information on this. My understanding is that this is payroll related, but it wasn't a purchase order that was set up by my office or by one of my departments. It would have been one that was set up through the auditor's office to make those payments to the pension fund. So that's kind of really all the information that I have about it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Powers. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes. All members present, voting aye, motion passes.
Resolution authorizing the city auditor to approve a then and now certificate from the General Fund 1001-0842-57153 to cover the cost of an invoice for Ohio Police and Fire Pension Fund for $35,769.13 and declaring an emergency. Resolution authorizing the city auditor to approve a then and now certificate from the General Fund 1001-0842-57153 to cover the cost of an invoice for Ohio Police and Fire Pension Fund for $35,769.13 and declaring an emergency. Resolution authorizing the city auditor to approve a then and now certificate from the General Fund 1001-0842-57153 to cover the cost of an invoice for Ohio Police and Fire Pension Fund for $35,769.13 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mr. Thompson.
Move we pass the resolution.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to pass the resolution. Mrs. Franzen.
I second.
Second by Mrs. Franzen. Any further discussion? Mr. Brady.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I'm a little leery about voting yes on this without a little more discussion or knowing what it is at least. So if anyone has any information on this, I'd like to hear it before the vote. I don't want to keep any funds from police and fire. That's not what I'm doing here.
Mr. Brady. Excuse me, sir. If in your packet, I think if you go to on the back,
Sure.
there is an explanation of what happened. If you'd like, I can read it.
If someone can brief it for me, I don't need.
Let me read this to you real quick. I think the invoice is there, and also this was a request by Marcus Patterson, the deputy auditor, a resolution authorizing a then and now for an invoice from Ohio Police and Fire Pension Fund in the amount of $35,769.13. This is for the 2023 fire semi-annual principal and interest. The invoice is dated 4/15/2023 with an invoice due date of 5/15/2023. This invoice did not reach the auditor's office. And here's a copy of the invoice. So
Thank you.
it appears they did not receive the invoice.
Thank you for that, Mr. President. I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
My paper. Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the resolution passes. Moving on to item M4. Item M4 reads, ordinance imposing a temporary moratorium on the consideration and/or granting of any zoning, occupancy, building or other permits or applications related to vape stores within the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency. Mr. Kelch.
I'd like to make a motion we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
Motion by Mr. Kelch to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Mrs. Hoover.
I'll second.
Second by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Mrs. Franzen.
I just want to say I appreciate seeing this ordinance. This is kind of weirdly, someone had just asked me about vape stores in Norwood and whether there's anything the city could do to change how they're regulated. So I think this is a good first step, and it seems like this is something other municipalities have done as well. And it doesn't permanently close off more vape stores. It's just a temporary thing to look at stuff. So Just kind of fortuitous that I got asked that question and then I saw it in my email the next day.
Anyone else? Ms. Royce?
Well, I don't know if I should ask now or like before we do the vote yes or no on it, but I'll just ask now since we got into substantive. So I noticed the ordinance says research is being conducted. Are we conducting the research or is it just general research?
If you'd like, Mr. Powers
Yeah.
can speak to it.
Yes, so this would allow the city to do research on it, to find out what other communities are doing about the issue, to research issues that can come with having so many vape shops, to look at zoning restrictions, to look at health licensure restrictions, decide what may be a good fit for our community, and then to make those recommendations and work through that process.
Do we know if there's like vape stores moving in immediately right now?
So as we...
I know there's existing ones.
Yeah,
So were we expecting an influx?
Well, I don't know that we have any right off the top of my head that I know are moving right in. In fact, it probably wouldn't impact those ones that we already would know about.
Right.
But being that we've gotten a number of them already opened, we thought it was a good opportunity to kind of slow that down a little bit, research this issue, and get a little bit more information about how we ought to take a look at this.
Okay.
Yes.
Ms. Hoover?
Is this something you'll partner with the Board of Health on, or is this something that the city is doing independently?
Well, it could go a number of different ways. So that some communities have looked at it through a Board of Health perspective. Some have looked at it as a zoning perspective. So this would give us an opportunity to decide if there's a path that we should take, and then which path should we take.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Powers. Anyone else? We have a motion by Mr. Kelch, a second by Mrs. Hoover to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes.
Ordinance imposing a temporary moratorium on the consideration and/or granting of any zoning, occupancy, building, or other permits or applications relating to vape stores within the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency. Ordinance imposing a temporary moratorium on the consideration and/or granting of any zoning, occupancy, building, or other permits or applications relating to vape stores within the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency. Ordinance imposing a temporary moratorium on the consideration and/or granting of any zoning, occupancy, building, or other permits or applications relating to vape stores within the city of Norwood and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mr. Braden?
Motion to pass the ordinance?
Motion by Mr. Braden to pass the ordinance. Mr. Kelch?
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item M5, an ordinance amending Chapter 561 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances entitled Parks and Playgrounds to expand and clarify alcohol permits. Mrs. Franzen.
I move that we have the first reading of this ordinance.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to have the first reading. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
Second that?
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Mrs. Franzen.
So just for those that aren't on Parks Committee, so this is in response to a request by Mr. Gabbard, the Recreation Director, when he wanted to try to host some different events in the parks. Looking through the ordinances, he realized that there are only two places that we allow alcohol to be consumed if you have a permit: Fenwick and Lower Millcrest, which seemed just kind of odd that those would be the only two places. So we felt it would be best to expand it to any place that you could get a permit from the Recreation Department to allow the consumption of alcohol within those permitted spaces. Obviously, this would you'd still have to clean up, you'd still have to make sure that you're not being drunk, unruly, disorderly, and this would not apply to people who just wander into a park with a drink and start to drink it on a public bench. So this would be something that you would have to have a permit. The recreation department would have to know about it, but it would allow people to, for instance, Mr. Gabbard said that the Norwood Historical Society wanted to have a bourbon tasting, so that would prevent that. This would allow that to occur, but illegally. So just to give it an explanation, yes.
But no liquor, so not a bourbon tasting.
Well, yeah, so that's my bad. Look, first of all, this is the second part of my, where I made a mistake last week. First of all, it was Veterans Day on Friday, and I forgot that. So there was no one here to put this on the agenda. So when I talked to Mr. Gabbard with this bourbon tasting, the idea would be, we had initially talked about it being just wine, beer, and hard cider, instead of extending that to just alcohol usage in general. And when I looked up other places where they have these public functions with permits required, they just say alcoholic liquor and possession of alcoholic liquor. They don't specify what kind of alcohol it is. So, yeah, that is my bad. And I apologize for my mistake in initially in the committee talking just about beer, wine, and liquor. It was just, I forgot that Mr. Gavitt had talked about a bourbon tasting specifically as a thing that might happen in the future. And I would be happy to resubmit this ordinance later if we need to change the language. I would love to hear from the law director from this, if there's something we need to change or if we need to table this because of my mistake. Thank you.
Mr. Moore?
Yeah, so I thought we did a revision before it came to the clerk's office, but it has not. So we will do one that fixes that particular alcohol definition problem.
Okay, yeah, because I had emailed Mr. Moore about it
Yeah.
prior, but with the Veterans Day thing, the thing that we're seeing here still says beer, wine, and hard cider. The intention was to change it to just alcohol usage in general, after I had talked to him and made sure that that was fine, and it seems there's no other weird restrictions that I thought there might be with hard liquor versus generally consumable stuff. So just wanted to let you know. My bad. That's why I figured just one reading, get it figured out, and I won't make that mistake again. I'll remember how Veterans Day works next time when it's on Saturday.
Thank you, Mrs. Franzen. Anyone else? We have a motion by Mrs. Franzen, a second by Mr. Thompson to have the first reading. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Ms. Royce.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes.
An ordinance amending Chapter 561 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances entitled Parks and Playgrounds to expand and clarify alcohol permits.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Moving on to item N, administrative reports. Mayor Schneider.
Thank you. Seems quick. Leaf collection, I'll say leaf collection is ongoing. I've watched the guys come down my street the day after. Typically, the day after your garbage day is leaf collection day. Unless, of course, there's rain or something going on that pushes them back, makes it take a little bit longer. But that's for bulk leaf collection. You can still put out bagged leaves. A lot of people still bag up their leaves, bag them up from the back and bring them out. You can put them out and they'll be collected up. There's no reason to call Public Works. There's no reason to send in a C-click fix or anything like that on your leaves. If you put them out to the curb, your bulk leaves will be picked up, like I said, the day after. So a couple other things. Vendors must be registered with the auditor's office. I know Spectrum and there have been some other vendors, people out knocking on doors. When they get their approval and get their soliciting license from the city of Norwood, we are vetting those people and we're making sure that they are the right people to be knocking on doors and not potential thieves or potential people that are going to do something nefarious in our community. So if somebody comes to your door and is knocking and selling something, they should have a vendor's license from the city of Norwood auditor's office that they can show you. If they do not have that vendor's license, there's some pretty stiff penalties. So if there's a problem where somebody gives you grief on that, you definitely want to call the police and get them in the neighborhood to chase that person off. They could be up to something that's not all good. talking about some of the fall preparations. We were talking about leaf collection. We just had the time change, and that's time to check batteries, right? Batteries in your smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors. Fireplaces and chimneys are starting to get used. Take a look at your fireplaces and chimneys. Door seals, screens, storm doors, things like that. All those are, that's sort of the public service announcement part of it. But it does, we do go through a change of seasons here in the city of Norwood, and everybody should be taking a look at those things. Disconnecting your outside water hose. I think we did that one time and I let it freeze, and that was a problem. So cleaning out the gutters and those things. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the developments that are going on. The old bingo hall on Montgomery Road has been sold, and there's some plans taking place for that. So it's going to be interesting to get that building restored, redeveloped, and back in operation, productive use. Factory 52 continues. I think what they have apartment-wise is pretty much filled. And they just added on 128 more units in the other part of it that have been brought online. And you really got to look at the POK group and their staff and the vision that they have. I mean, they've got big plans for that area. And as all of you know, because everybody I'm sure has been over there by now, it's an incredible, vibrant. I mean, it brings so much to our city. It's so much fun. But they're also working on the 4747 Pike, the old hotel property right up here, and laying out the road that will come, Crown will come back out to Montgomery Road. So those are big developments going on. And then the Perry and Derrick site, we continue to work with the Port Authority, Mike Skelly. Oh yeah, I got to talk about Mike Skelly too, but Mike Skelly's working with the Port Authority on some of the demolition and revitalization of that Perry and Derrick site. And the last thing, well, I'll talk about the data collection towers. Data collection towers for our water systems are going up in certain areas, and some of those are actually active, which means, of course, that finally the city of Norwood is not sending a water meter reader into every basement in every house in this community. It's not fully completed yet, but there's a lot of them that are active and we're collecting data that way. And then I had the fun of running in the Gym of the Highlands 5K that was put on here recently. And it's interesting because the safety service director's son took the middle of his age group. He's right in the middle of that thing. And it's strange because the safety service director's right in the middle of that pack too. So he should be really proud of himself being in the middle of that pack too. And then Mike Skelly, our community development director, I said I had to talk, took his age group. So at the beginning of the race, I said, Mike, you're carrying the torch for Norwood, for all the employees of the city of Norwood. And he did us proud. So thank you, Mike. That's all I have, guys. Thank you.
Any questions or comments for Mayor Schneider? Thank you, Mayor Schneider. Moving on to item O, unfinished business. Do we have any unfinished business this evening? Mrs. Hoover.
I just wanted to mention, I mentioned last time, the Norwood Mound, the storyboard that the library put together is up. It's really lovely. It's the story, We Are the Water Protectors. If you don't know what a storyboard is, it's big panels from a book, and so you go up and you walk around the mound. It's really, really lovely. We are so very fortunate to have the mound here. So I would encourage people to check that out. It will be up for the month of November as part of Native American Heritage Month.
Thank you, Mrs. Hoover.
Thank you, sir.
Anyone else? Any other unfinished business this evening? Mrs. Winterbauer.
To kind of finalize the climate safe neighborhoods, the residents that have been working in Ward 1 and 4, they're going to have their showcase on November 28th at the community center at 5:30 to present all of their data and information that they have been working on the past few months. So I highly recommend going. It's been exciting to watch them work through everything.
Thank you, Mrs. Winterbauer.
5:30.
Anyone else? We'll move on to new business. Any new business this evening? Mrs. Franzen.
I just wanted to thank everyone that came out to the 5K event. It was really well attended. We couldn't have asked for better weather. And I especially want to thank Norwood Police and Fire for being there and keeping the event safe. Mr. Ron Murphy for manning the grill, as always. The hot dogs were delicious. And yeah, it was just a really nice event, and I'm glad that I was able to be a small part of it. I was in the lead pace car because they said I shouldn't bike, like I normally do for some reason, felt that I would not be fast enough, which I feel personally offensive, but that's okay. But yeah, thank you all for anyone who came, volunteered, showed up with their kids or just for themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Anyone else? Any other new business this evening? And we'll move on to communications. Communications Q1, Mike Skelly, Community Development Director, regarding Q&A following 1024 Council Public Hearing for Proposed Zoning Ordinance Amendment.
To Norwood City Council, this memo addresses those comments raised at the above noted meeting and is intended to assist council in its discussions and deliberations on this matter. A, concern that a 100 feet setback from Montgomery Road may be excessive. The proposed policy to section 1151.36.b, electric vehicle recharging station, is divided into two types. 1, EV parking for 6 to 14 stalls. 2, EV parking for 15 or more. Staff believe that this policy is reasonable for the following reasons. The Planning Commission's goal is to avoid and minimize EV parking lots, particularly those associated equipment in close proximity to Norwood's key NS north-south thoroughfare, which traverses our downtown corridor. The city already has policies restricting auto-related land uses and ensuring that existing and new buildings are located close to the street and sidewalk to better foster pedestrian shopper activity. This policy is just applicable for 6 to 14 stalls. Developers/property owners/retail shops will still be allowed to have 5 or less charging stalls without any regulation. The 100 feet is provided as a secondary dimensional qualifier. A developer could still request relief from the BZA with a compelling justification. Many of those properties fronting Montgomery Road are smaller commercial lots that have a depth of less than 150 feet, so it would already be difficult to locate any reasonable amount of off-street parking without further lot consolidation. B, concern for directional signage. Directional, wayfinding, or related traffic signs are not included in either the current sign, Chapter 1321, or zoning code ordinance, Chapter 11. However, this was regulated prior to the 2017 Chapter 1321 amendments, used to be recognized as exempt signs if they were less than 4 square feet in area. The basis for the proposed EV policy is to minimize visual clutter and ensure that no off-site advertising/commercial signage is used in or near EV parking lots.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mrs. Winterbauer?
Motion to receive and file?
Motion by Mrs. Winterbauer to receive and file. Ms. Royce?
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Royce. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to item Q2, letter from NOAA Power Safety Service Director regarding the water rates increase of 5.55%.
Dear President and members of Norwood City Council, I have enclosed a copy of the ordinance from the City of Cincinnati raising the water rates to the City of Norwood by 5.55%. Norwood Ordinance 20-1992 states the Director of Public Service shall levy and assess charges in a sufficient amount to pay the current operating expenses and costs of permanent improvements to the city waterworks or water system on an annual basis. The Director of Public Service shall notify council in written form of every increase in the water charges or assessments at least 30 days prior to the implementation of the same. With regard to the above, the City of Norwood water rates will be increased by 5.55% beginning on January 1, 2024. We are working diligently to continue improving our water service throughout the city, and keeping customer rates in line with purchasing rates is of the utmost importance. I have also attached information regarding the CAP program for low-income seniors to assist with this rate increase. Sincerely, NOAA Power's Safety Service Director.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mr. Braden?
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to make a motion to reluctantly receive and file the communications.
Motion by Mr. Braden to receive and file. Mr. Kelch,
Second.
second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Mrs. Hoover?
Actually, I just had a request for Mr. Powers. I know in the past you put up on the website, or had put up on the website, the information for that assistance. I'm wondering if we would be able to do that again.
I believe it's still posted there. It's also running on our slideshow down
On
in
the
the
banner.
hallway.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Powers.
I will double check to make sure that's still on our website. If it isn't, I'll put it back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Hoover. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, motion passes. Moving on to Q3, Mayor's Court report.
Dear Mr. President and council members, enclosed, please find the report for Norwood Mayor's Court for the month of October 2023. Should you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Sincerely, Victor Schneider, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Thank you, Mr. Gears. Mr. Thompson.
Move we receive and file.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to receive and file. Mrs. Hoover.
I'll second.
Second by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, motion passes. Moving on to adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn? Mrs. Hoover.
I make a motion, we adjourn.
Motion by Mrs. Hoover. May I have a second? Mr. Thompson.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mrs. Winterbauer?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, sir.
All members present, voting aye, motion passes. We are adjourned.